Hey guys, I'm glad that you're here with us to continue the conversation on identity. This week, we'll talk about how culture and ethnicity are good parts of God's design for the world and who He created us to be. Let's find out as we welcome back author and Cruise staff, Matt Michaelatis.
When I was in college, my friend from the South came to visit. I grew up in the West Coast in California. He's from the deep, deep South. White guy, and he was in the Navy. And he comes and he's from a type of church called a Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, which is a church that was started in Arkansas, and there are actually like tiny little Landmark Missionary Baptist churches all over the United States. And this is the only kind of church he goes to. So he says, Matt, this week, let's go to a Missionary Baptist church when I come to visit you. And I say, that's fine, let's do that. So he picks me up, and we drive and we go to a Missionary Baptist church. Well, there's the Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, which was started in Arkansas, and then there's Missionary Baptist Church, which is an African-American denomination. And this was actually an African-American Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, which we didn't know until we walked in and sat down, and I'm wearing like jeans and a scruffy t-shirt, and everyone else looks sharp. Like so good. The women all have these beautiful hats on. The men are all in amazing suits. And the preacher gets up front. We're feeling a little weird, my friend Dell especially. And the pastor gets up front and he says, brothers and sisters, we have 2 visitors with us today. And we're like, what? Where? Clearly it was us. And he had us stand up and share our names. And he welcomed us really warmly. And then he had us read the scriptures. So he would, Brother Matt, stand up and read this scripture. So stand up and read. And everyone was so kind, so generous. Everyone was coming over and talking to us afterwards. The service was like 2 hours long. And we had planned for an hour maybe, because we were used to going to white church. And as we're getting ready to leave, the pastor comes over with his entire family, his daughter, his wife, a couple other of his sons. And they come over and they say, we are taking a short break for lunch. And we hope that you'll come back for the rest of the service. And we were like, the rest of the service? What? I don't understand. Like, we're well beyond our budgeted church time for the day. And they were so friendly, so kind, so welcoming. And we for sure did not go back after lunch. Because it was a different world, a different culture, right? We felt out of place. We were out of place for a variety of reasons. And this is actually something that within the church community that we're in the middle of a big conversation about right now, is how do we follow Jesus well, despite coming from different ethnicities, different cultures? What does it mean to follow Jesus? Do we all need to come to one culture, or is it okay that we're all from different cultures? Do we need to all be worshiping in one place or in many places? And there are all these questions wrapped up in this. And on the flip side, right, if one of my African-American friends from my dorm had come with me to my weird 1-hour white person service where everyone is dressed disrespectfully and the music is like so simple people can sing, and that the sermon is 15 minutes and no one responds, and then it's over, it feels weird, right? It feels disrespectful, it feels strange, it feels like we're not investing any time in the Lord because of some cultural differences. So how do we deal with this, and what does this matter, and what does this look like? And to start with, I just want to look at this scripture from Acts 17. In Acts 17, we have a story where Paul, one of the early followers of Jesus, is speaking to some Greeks. He's not Greek, he's Jewish. And he's like the most Jewish person of all time. And he goes to Greece, where literally the word barbarian, I don't know if I'm Greek, by the way. The word barbarian, do you know this? The reason we have this name, it comes from the Greek. The Greeks said, everyone else sounds stupid when they talk. They're like, bar, 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 bar. And so they started calling him, oh, who's that guy? Oh, he's just a barbarian, right? That's where the word actually comes from, is Greek people making fun of non-Greek people. So just remember that next time you use our word. So Paul is here with these people, the Greeks. They're incredibly different culturally in a variety of ways. And it's this gigantic city, and he comes from what they would think of as a really backwater little town provincial, weird, strange culture, strange ideas. So it says Paul was waiting in Athens. He was greatly distressed by all the idols in the city, all the false gods that they were worshiping. And it says, so he went to this place where in the marketplace, people would have these conversations like, it was the internet basically, like come together with all your crazy ideas and let's talk it out. You're a flat earther? Cool, I'd love to hear about that. And then they'd be like, okay, you're dumb, but keep talking, it's awesome. So this is what they would do. So there were Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, Greek philosophers, and some of them were listening to Paul and they said, what is this babbler trying to say? And others said, well, he seems to be advocating for foreign gods. And they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him to a big meeting at this place called, you've probably heard it called Mars Hill, or it's called the Areopagus. Either one, same thing. We're translating it into English either way. And so he gets there, and they say, tell us, what is this new teaching? What are you talking about? You're bringing strange ideas, and we collect them, and we would like to know what you're talking about. And it actually says this, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. So Paul stood up in the middle of the Areopagus and he said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. I even saw, as I was walking around, an object of worship that said this, to an unknown God. So you're ignorant of who you're worshiping. You're like, in case we missed one, here's this altar to this God. We don't know who that God is, but we don't want to make this God angry. So to the unknown God, he said, okay, you don't know who the God is, but I do. And I'm going to tell you about the unknown God. And he says this, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. And he doesn't live in temples. You don't have to go to a specific place to worship him. Not a temple built by human hands. He's not even served by human hands because he doesn't need anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. And from one person he made all people, all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out the appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. So he says, every person on earth, God chose the time and the place where they would live. Every people group, the time and place that they would inhabit in the world. Why? Why would he do that? And he answers, God did this so that these people would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, even though he's not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. So what's really interesting here, a couple things. One is Paul says, whatever culture you're from, whatever background, whatever your ethnicity, whatever your people, whatever your language, God chose the time and the place where you would live, where your people would live, where our people would live, so that you might seek and perhaps find him, even though he's not far from any of us. And then he does this fascinating thing. He starts quoting from Greek philosophy, poems, and plays, where even actually God is not far from any one of us. And as one of your own poets has said, he is our offspring. These are all from poems about Zeus, which is just nuts. And what he's saying is, you don't have it all figured out, but look, there's this piece in your culture, in your belief set that is true and is moving you toward what is true, toward God. So he says the culture, for Paul, the culture is not something to be fought against. There is no idea in Christianity that we are meant to go and alter people's culture to bring them to Christ. Now, there are things about every culture that is broken, but we don't have to pull people out of their cultures to bring them to Christ at all, because God made our cultures. God made our ethnicities. And ethnicity is partly about culture, the language you speak, the traditions of your family, of the people you grew up with, of the community you were born in. Whatever that might be, and it's different for all of us, and it gets very complicated the more we start going into it. So Paul says God has chosen the exact time and place where all people live so that they might seek him and perhaps find him. And Paul then uses the culture of the people he's speaking to, their philosophy, their ideas, to say to them, there is a way for you to come and know God better in your culture, in your philosophy. So he's not looking to disagree, he's looking for places of agreement. And then he says this, and I think this is really important for us as followers of Jesus. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. Paul says this, same guy, right? Writing at a different time. He says, I'm free. I don't belong to anyone, but I've made myself a slave or a servant to everyone. Why? To win as many as possible. To the Jews, when I'm home in my home culture, I become a Jew. I act like a Jewish person. I follow the cultural norms of the Jewish people. I embrace my Jewishness to win the Jews. They're under the law, right? So to those under the law, I become like one under the law, even though I know as a follower of Christ, I'm free. I'm not under the law, not in the way they are. Why? So that I can win the ones that are under the law. I embrace their culture. To those not having the law, to those who aren't Jewish, right? That the law was given to the Jewish people. To those who aren't Jewish, so like the Greeks, the Romans, people like that. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law. I'll actually break the law of the Romans. And he gets in big fights about this with other early Christians. To those not under the law, I behave as someone who doesn't have the law, even though I'm not free from God's law, but I live under Christ's law. Why? So as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I did this all for the sake of the good news, that I might share in its blessings. Too often, and we see this in devastating effect in evangelical history, too often we have believed that the way that we convert people to Jesus is by converting them to our culture. And that's why you can go to almost any nation on the planet today and find little tiny white churches that look like they were built in Kansas, right? Because we sent missionaries into other cultures and other places, and they said, you can't follow Jesus as a person from South America. You must become like someone from our culture, like kind of a Eurocentric or a North American culture. And the same thing in Africa and in Asia. And instead of saying, how does someone from your culture follow Jesus well? Right? Not how do you become my culture, because I've figured out how to follow Jesus, so you should wear the same kind of clothes as me and do all these things. And it's still happening today. And it's hard to see. It's so hard to see because our own culture is invisible to us. And whatever culture you're in, whatever culture you're from, crossing cultures can be difficult because we think our own culture, it's comfortable, it's familiar, it makes sense. And questioning your own culture is very difficult. But let me give you an example. There's some women in the city I live in, white women from an evangelical church, wonderful women, who said, we want to reach the Latinx women in our community, right? So Hispanic and Latinx women. So what they did is they said, okay, let's set up a Bible study on Tuesdays at like 1 in the afternoon, so kids will still be in school, everyone's available, and we'll invite all these women to come to our Bible study. And they were trying, right? They're really trying. They're like, we'll speak Spanish, we'll do the whole thing, whatever it takes. So they go out and they make flyers and they make announcements, they put them all over the community. And at their first Bible study, no one came. No one came. Now here's where it could go either way. Because what could happen, and what often does happen in our lives, is that our conclusion is these people are not interested in Jesus, meaning this group of people, the Hispanic and Latinx women in our community, are not interested. But these women did something different. They said, let's go ask them. So they found a Latina neighbor, and they went to her and said, why did no one come to our Bible study? And she said, we all work, all of us. Everyone in our community is working. So we can't come to Bible study at that time. And if you do it at 6 at night, we're not going to be able to come at that time because we're cooking meals. And if you do it at 8 at night, we're not going to be able to come. We're getting the kids into bed. We're preparing things for the next day. If you want to have a Bible study we'll come to, it has to be at 11 at night. And so these wonderful white women said, okay, let's do it at 11 at night. And they had 30 women come the first week. because they'd made an assumption about culture, that everyone was like them, that they were actually in a different family and financial place than others in their community, and assumed everyone has the same story, the same background, the same values, and they don't. So instead of saying, oh, those women must not want Jesus, they said, how do we embrace their culture, their community, their way of doing things, and create it for them? Which altered things really drastically. And they became very beloved friends in that community. And as we start looking at the things, evangelicalism is not only theology, evangelicalism is a culture. And it was started largely by European white men who are middle and upper class. And evangelicalism is a movement that has been contextualized to those people. And that's why we are seeing places where we are having conflict and difficulty as we start looking at evangelicalism in the context of women, evangelicalism in the context of the poor or the very wealthy, or people of other cultural backgrounds. And we're trying to figure out, we're working on how do we contextualize the good news and Jesus, regardless of a person's background, ethnicity, gender, all these things. And all these things, again, are beautiful things created by God. So this is right, this is good, that would be the response in Christian community that we should be trying to figure out. So when you start thinking about things like how long is your church service, that's a cultural value. Like African American church will likely be much longer than my church. Who's on stage leading worship? How long is a sermon? What day of the week is Bible study on? The kind of music we use, the Bible translation we use, the languages that are spoken, wedding traditions, the kind of clothes we wear. The clothes we wear. See, that's a cultural issue that comes from just saying things wrong. The thing is, we need to know our personal culture to be able to understand cultures of others. Which things are actually about following Jesus and which things are just my preference because of who I am and how I've grown up and the community I've been in. Because we can't go to other cultures if we're assuming their culture needs become ours. Here's an example from Cru. We have an organization within Cru called Destino, which services students who are from the Latinx and Hispanic community. That's their cultural, that's where they would come from first culturally, yeah? And we have sort of a phrase we use often in the campus ministry. We want to turn lost students into Christ-centered laborers. Sounds pretty good, right? But what Destino said was, you know what? The word laborers has a really different meaning in our community. And a lot of us don't want to be turned into laborers. So we changed it for Destino, turning lost students into Christ-centered leaders. And that makes a lot more sense in that community. And that's what we're doing. And that I have a lot of other examples we could go through. But I would say this, here's 3 things. In evangelism, when we're doing evangelism like Paul, we embrace the culture of the hearer, the person who we want to hear the good news. We embrace their culture. In the church, we embrace the culture of one another. We have to get to this place of preferring others over ourselves, which means we come together, we make compromises, and we build a new culture together. Doesn't mean we can't worship separately sometimes and things like that, but for us to really get to a place of what we're going to be in heaven, we have to get to this place of learning each other's cultures and building up each other's cultures, preferring each other's cultures at different times. And also we have to embrace, not on ethnic lines necessarily, but on racial lines. Race has often, almost always, not just often, almost always been used as a way to exploit and harm people who are different. And in our US culture, in a very specific direction by very specific people. And what we see in the Bible, when people who were harmed along these sorts of lines, what was done? In Acts, we see the Greek widows were not getting food in the church, in the context of church, I'm saying. What happened? The apostles looked at that, the apostles, the leaders of the church, and they said, let's put Greek people in charge of handing out the food. Because those who had been harmed needed to be empowered, and those empowered people then took care of everyone. So that's something we need to grow in and learn. So Revelation 7 is this beautiful moment where John, who wrote Revelation, says he looks and he sees this great multitude, people of every tribe, meaning every people group, of every tongue, every language, and every nation. Again, talking about the ethnos, the ethnicity. Every tribe, every tongue, every nation gathered together and praying together before the throne. God loves your ethnicity, whatever you may have been told by other people, whatever you may have been told by our culture, whatever you may have been told by people of other ethnicities or other races. God loves you, your ethnicity, your gender, everything about you. He chose these things so that we might perhaps seek and find him. And those are things we need to celebrate together because God's making sure that people like you, like us, like me, that we're going to be represented together in the community of Christ in the kingdom to come. So, and remember this too. When God looked at his creation, when he looked at human beings, what did he say? He said, "It is very good." That's true of you. That's true of me. That's true of us. Thank you. Okay, there might be some questions. Let's hear them.
I guess I'm just looking for your thoughts on how I'm someone who is very aware of like different cultures and wanting to bring them all together and be well represented as what the kingdom of heaven is going to look like. Do you have suggestions on like how do we go about that as Christians? We don't want to say, well, my culture is better or this culture is better, but how do we make a change to become one and still each be represented well?
Yeah, I can answer this by saying it's really hard. I, for a long time, 8 years, attended a church that had been majority culture, so almost all white, and then said, our vision statement has always been to reach our county for Christ. But when we look at our church, we're only reaching the white people. So either we need to change our vision statement to reaching the white people of our county, or we need to change something about our church so that we're reaching other people in our community. So what they did is they started hiring pastors from these other communities. Enormous discomfort came for everyone as we started to come together. So some of it was little stuff, like I remember once I was about to throw away a plastic cover, like a disposable tablecloth. I was about to throw it away. And this Korean woman comes running up and she's like, "What are you doing? We saved these." She folded it up and put it away, right? So some of it's little things. Or in our church, if you asked any of the white people in our church, they would say, "We don't speak in tongues here." If you talk to any of the Korean people, they would say, "Of course we speak in tongues." The white people didn't know because they thought it was Korean. So there are these moments where there's even theological differences. So I think a couple things. One is we have to build relationship. As we love each other, we find it easier to make space for each other. So that's one piece. I think the other piece is we have to watch really carefully in whatever culture you're in. So in the US, it would be one thing. In China, it would be something else. But what tends to happen is if we bring multiple cultures together, the majority culture will then dominate. Like the majority culture will make some small changes and all the minority cultures will make large changes, and there'll be a slight shift, but not a real shift for the majority culture. And that's not what we're looking to do. So that's part of the reason why, honestly, a lot of times, a lot of churches are still meeting on segregated lines because there's not a place to come together and have a true third culture. It's really just majority culture with slight alterations in a lot of places. So I think that's an important thing, is making sure your leadership is such that people are represented from whatever cultures and ethnicities are in the room, and genders, I would say too. And then also making sure that we're making decisions together about which things are most important to be represented as we're following Christ together. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's a good question. And no one knows the answer is part of the problem. We're all working on it. Yeah. Well, we're not all working on it. Some are working on it. Yeah, who else?
So what if you grew up with a background where you're not familiar with your own culture or identity, and you were put into this other culture in which it's not yours or something like that?
Yeah, I know. I think I know what you're saying. So you're saying, what if you grew up in a culture that you feel like is not represented by what people think your culture should be?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. So can I talk a little bit about race versus ethnicity? Would that be okay? And it comes to your question. Race is something that's invented. It's something that's largely about our external presentment. It's how someone decides where we fit. And it has largely been used through history since its invention, which is relatively recent, to control people or oppress people by whoever was in the majority. And this is just not in the US, in other places too. Ethnicity is much more about our experience. Like there is a piece of it that is racial in the sense that oftentimes someone can look at us and have a clue about our culture, our background, our ethnicity. Ethnicity can be stuff like language, where you grew up, family tradition, and history. So there are people, for instance, who, let's take a kid who's adopted from China into a white family. That kid grows up functionally as a member of majority culture, largely. I mean, there's some differences, right? So when someone comes with, say that person goes back to China and Chinese people are like, why don't you speak Chinese? That seems really weird. That we're getting into these issues of presumptions and ideas about what someone else should get. So I think what the great example is Trevor Noah. You guys know Trevor Noah? So pretty well-known late night host. And for those of you who know Trevor, like you can picture him, what would you say is his race?
He's black.
Trevor is black. Now here's what's fascinating. Trevor has a mom from South Africa and a dad from Sweden who's like the whitest dude ever, like blonde hair white. But Trevor is black. Why is he black? Because he looks black, right? That's race. That's us on the external deciding who he is, yeah? Now, when we start trying to think of how to explain Trevor Noah, like what would you, let's say Trevor's filling out his little form to say what he is. What is he, can we call Trevor African American? Well, Trevor's from South Africa. He's been living in the US for like 4 years. So that's weird. Same thing, a black person whose family comes from the Caribbean is not African American, right? A black person in Britain is not African American, yeah? So we start getting into all these complexities. So why can we not call Trevor white? He's as much white as he is black. Well, that's when we start getting into complexities. So part of what happens is this assumption that we're a part of a certain community, certain background, a certain way of doing things. And it can be really painful as we're looking for discovering what does this say about me, right? Where do I fit in? And people's assumptions about you from different communities and different sides can be really painful. So I think the thing that I think is important personally, and I'm guessing a different background and experience, right, than every person in this room. But what I see that is consistently helpful for people is to first embrace that who you are right now, without changing anything, without learning more about other backgrounds, other cultures, other things from your cultural or communal background, is to say you as you are something beautiful and wonderful, and you don't have to change any of that. You don't have to grow in any of those things. I would say at the same time, there is something in the human experience that expands and increases your capacity to love others by entering into multiple communities, ethnicities, and backgrounds. So I think there's super strong value in growing in those things, but I don't think it's when you're talking about your personal self, I think it's just really complicated. And figuring out the best way to do it with the least damage to yourself just takes some time and a piece of a community that you feel comfortable in. Am I answering your question, or am I answering a really different question?
I believe you're answering my question.
Ask me a follow-up if I'm not there.
I kind of forgot my question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's a great question. Great question.
Aaron, what would be some good questions to ask our friends to be able to learn more about their culture?
I think really similarly to when we're doing evangelism, there's real sensitivity, can be, on these topics. Because what you're asking is for someone to share something pretty personal, potentially, depending on where the conversation goes. So one of the things you want to do is just build trust. Make sure they know that you're interested and that you're owning it. And I think acknowledging that you also have a culture, right? And ethnicity. There's sometimes, particularly with white folks in the US, there's a presumption that, so we see this like at the grocery store. My grocery store near my house has a section for ethnic food. But it's not like white people food. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no Greek food there. There's no Irish food. Like we're talking about something very specific there. And so it makes it sound like there's not ethnicity for me, and there is. I'm Greek, I'm Irish. And there's some things wrapped up in that culturally for me. So I think entering in as a peer and being honest about like, hey, I'm just trying to learn and grow, and I realize I'm gonna make mistakes. And the other thing I would say, if you're coming from the majority culture to someone in the minority culture, a minority culture, be aware that there is some work involved for the person in the minority culture to share their thoughts, ideas, input, and what you don't want to have happen where they get exhausted because they feel like they constantly have to teach you things. So just being sensitive to that, I think, and thankful when people are sharing about stuff from their culture. And particularly when you're going majority culture to minority culture. Oftentimes what happens is minority cultures have been forced to learn about majority culture already to survive in the larger culture. So they may not have tons to learn from a majority culture person starting out, depending on the topic, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind too. And whatever your culture, most of us are learning about our own cultures as well along the way. And I remember I was at a conference once and I was the only white person on stage at like a round table thing, and I shared some things, and this white guy came up to me afterwards and he goes, "You don't speak for me." And I was like, "Oh, so you're saying that as a white person I'm individual and different than you and I can't speak for all white people?" He's like, "Right." I was like, "Well, that's true of everyone else on the stage too, yeah? That we're individuals. And that what might be true for one of my Asian American friends might be vastly, vastly different from my other Asian American friends, especially, well, and I'm gonna go into too many things. I'll just say one more thing. When you start looking particularly at Hispanic and Latinx culture, that's not a racially based ethnicity. That's an ethnicity based around culture, which means language you speak and things like that. So you can be black and Latino, you can be white and Latina, you can be Asian in background, like physically, like your family is from Asia originally, but you grew up in Brazil, right? So it gets massively complicated. So part of what we're doing is just getting to know each other as individuals and our culture and our background that we come from. And it takes work for everybody. But it's beautiful and it's worth doing. Great question. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed it.
Culture and ethnicity are created by God and will continue in the heavenly kingdom. It's part of who you are, who He made you to be. As you think about who God created you to be, do you ever have questions about your culture? To help you dig deeper, we're inviting you to take the culture test. It's a quick 5-minute assessment that helps you identify your culture. Take a second to text cultural to 555-888 and we'll send it your way.